Welcome to Void Case Files. I'm your host, and before we dive into tonight's story, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now. We're racing toward 1,000 subscribers by New Year, and we're posting daily videos to get there. With your help, we're going to make it happen. Now imagine scaling the highest peaks, pushing beyond every known boundary, only to encounter a creature from legend that speaks. But what if its ancient words aren't a welcome but a terrifying warning? Prepare for a story where the unknown isn't just lurking, it's talking. Tonight's case is based on real events that occurred in July 1924 near Mount St. Helens, Washington. What happened at a remote mining camp would become one of the most famous and terrifying Sasquatch encounters ever documented. The location was so notorious, it was renamed after the incident. To this day, hikers who venture into Ape Canyon report hearing things that shouldn't exist. This is the true account of Daniel Reeves, a wilderness guide who retraced the steps of those 1924 miners in October 2019. What he discovered suggests that the attack 95 years ago wasn't random, and that something has been waiting in those mountains ever since. This is his story. Before we begin, you need to understand what happened in that canyon nearly a century ago. In July of 1924, 5 gold miners were working a claim they called the Vander White Mine, deep in the wilderness east of Mount St. Helens. Fred Beck, Marion Smith, Roy Smith, Gabe Lefevre, and John Peterson had been prospecting in the area for 6 years. They'd found large footprints by creek beds and springs, tracks that measured 19 inches long. No known animal could have made them. For weeks before the attack, the miners had been hearing strange sounds, a shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. They'd hear it coming from one ridge, then an answering whistle from another ridge. It was like a conversation happening in the darkness around their cabin. Then one morning in mid-July, Fred Beck and Marion Smith went to fetch water from a nearby spring. As they approached, Marion suddenly raised his rifle. Standing on the other side of the spring next to a large pine tree was a creature unlike anything they'd ever seen. 7 feet tall, covered in blackish-brown hair, with an ape-like face but walking upright like a man. Marion fired 3 shots. The bullet struck the tree, exploding bark into the air. The creature vanished into the woods, only to reappear 200 yards down the canyon. Fred fired 3 more shots but missed. The creature disappeared again. That night, the miners decided they would leave at first light. They'd abandoned claims before, but this felt different. This felt dangerous. They never made it to morning. Around midnight, a massive blow struck the side of the cabin, and then another. Rocks and boulders began pelting the walls, hurled with incredible force. The structure shuddered under the assault. Through gaps in the logs, Fred Beck saw them. Multiple hulking, hair-covered figures circling the cabin. Mountain devils, he called them. The miners fired their rifles through the walls. The attack would pause, then resume in waves. The creatures hurled rocks through the roof, tore a hole in the door, briefly grabbed an axe before being driven back. Their screams filled the night, unearthly and terrible. The smell was worse, a putrid stench that made it hard to breathe. The siege continued until dawn. When sunlight finally broke over the ridge, Fred Beck spotted one of the creatures standing near the edge of the canyon, about 80 yards away. He fired 3 times. The creature toppled backward and fell into the gorge, plummeting 400 feet to the rocks below. The 5 miners fled. They left behind $200 in supplies, powder, and drilling equipment. They left a lucrative gold claim. They left everything. When they reached Spirit Lake and reported what happened to the ranger station, their story leaked to the newspapers. The Great Hairy Ape Hunt of 1924 was on. Reporters came from Portland and Seattle. A big game hunter arrived from England with an elephant gun. Hundreds of people flooded into the area searching for the creatures. They found nothing. No bodies, no creatures. Only large tracks that couldn't be explained. But a Klallam tribe member named J.W.G. Totsky wrote an article for the Oregonian with a different perspective. He said the creatures weren't apes at all. They were the Siatic, a race of hairy giants from indigenous legends, 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in hair, capable of moving silently through the forest. The stories said they were intelligent, spiritual beings who guarded certain places. And the legends carried a warning. If you kill one of them, the others will come for revenge. The canyon where the attack occurred was renamed. From that day forward, it was known as Ape Canyon. That was July 1924. Now let me tell you what happened in October 2019. Daniel Reeves was 37 years old and had been a wilderness guide for a decade, but his real passion was cryptozoology and Native American oral traditions. He'd been fascinated by the Ape Canyon incident since childhood, poring over Fred Beck's account in the book I Fought the Ape Men of Mount St. Helens. On Wednesday, October 2nd, 2019, Daniel met with clients in Seattle. They were from a private cryptozoology research organization. They wanted him to locate the original cabin site from the 1924 incident. The cabin had been lost since the Mount St. Helens eruption in 1980 reshaped the landscape. The job paid $15,000 plus equipment. Good money for a few weeks in the wilderness doing what Daniel loved. But during the meeting, one of the clients mentioned something that stuck with him. Local Yakima tribe members refused to enter the canyon. They still call it by the old name, the name it had before 1924, and they still speak of the Sasquatch as if they're real, living beings. The Sasquatch still guard their territory, the client said. At least that's what the elders claim. Daniel smiled politely. He believed in keeping an open mind, but after 10 years in the wilderness, he'd never seen anything that couldn't be explained. He was about to change his mind. On Monday, October 7th, Daniel began his trek at 7:30 in the morning from the Spirit Lake Ranger Station. The weather was wrong for early October. The temperature hovered in the low 30s, unseasonably cold. A ranger warned him about the forecast, a storm system moving in by midweek. The 6-mile hike to the Ape Canyon trailhead was uneventful. Beautiful even, dense evergreen forests, the kind of old growth that makes you feel small and insignificant in the best way possible. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Daniel left the marked trail and began his descent into the canyon itself. This was where things got difficult. No maintained path, just steep inclines and thick underbrush that grabbed at his pack and clothing. He used GPS coordinates provided by a researcher named Mark Mersel, who'd actually found the cabin site back in 2013 after years of searching, using old photographs and surveying techniques. The forest here was different, quieter. Daniel noticed it immediately. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering in the branches, no insects buzzing, just the sound of his own breathing and his boots on the forest floor. The silence was so complete it felt almost unnatural, like the forest was holding its breath. At 5:20 in the evening, he reached an area that matched the historical photographs. Old-growth stumps, their tops flattened by axe work from nearly a century ago. The wood was weathered grey, but still solid. He was close. Daniel set up his camp near a small spring, the same spring where Fred Beck and Marion Smith had their first encounter all those years ago. The water was crystal clear and ice cold, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. He documented the stumps, took measurements, compared them to the 1924 photos on his tablet. The location was right. After 95 years, he was standing where the Vander White Mine cabin once stood. He built a fire as darkness fell, the flames pushing back against the encroaching night. He heated water for freeze-dried chili and settled into his sleeping bag around 9 o'clock. The temperature was dropping fast. His breath misted in the air inside his tent. Daniel fell asleep thinking about those 5 miners, huddled in their cabin, while something terrible circled outside. He wondered if they'd felt this same oppressive silence, this weight in the air that suggested something watching and waiting. He woke at 6:15 the next morning to heavy mist, the kind that turns the forest into a ghost world, where trees appear and disappear like phantoms, and distance becomes meaningless. He unzipped his tent and immediately noticed something wrong. His coffee pot had been moved. He'd left it by the fire ring, upside down on a flat stone to keep it clean. Now it sat upright on a different rock 20 feet from his tent, positioned as if someone had picked it up, examined it carefully, and placed it somewhere else with deliberate intention. Daniel's skin prickled with sudden awareness. He stepped out of the tent slowly, scanning the campsite with growing unease. Everything else appeared untouched. His pack still hung from a tree branch where he'd bear-bagged it. His boots sat exactly where he'd left them outside the tent. But the coffee pot had definitely moved, and there was no logical explanation for it. He told himself it could have been an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a bear cub being curious. Except as he examined the soft earth around his tent more carefully, looking for any sign of what had visited in the night, he found nothing. No tracks, no disturbances in the pine needles and soil. It was as if something had floated through his camp, rearranging things without ever touching the ground. Then he walked to the spring to fill his water bottles, and his rational explanations evaporated completely. The footprint was at the edge of the water, pressed deep into the mud where something heavy had stood. 17 inches long, clearly defined in the soft earth. 5 toes, each one distinct. Daniel knelt beside it, hardly breathing. He could see the dermal ridges, the fine lines in the skin that shouldn't exist on a fake print. This was real. This was from something living and breathing that had stood here, probably watching his tent in the darkness. His hands shook as he took photographs from multiple angles, making sure to include his knife for scale. He mixed plaster in a collapsible bucket and made a cast, the whole process taking 20 careful minutes. The entire time, he felt eyes on him. Not the casual awareness of being watched by a deer or other wildlife. This was different. This was intelligence assessing him, studying him with purpose. At 8:30, he heard it for the first time. Wood knocking. 3 solid knocks echoing through the mist. A pause, then 2 more knocks. The sound came from upslope, maybe half a mile away. It was too rhythmic to be natural, too deliberate to be random. Daniel grabbed his digital recorder and captured the audio, his finger trembling on the record button. The knocks were perfectly spaced, like Morse code from something that understood communication. He spent the morning documenting what he believed was the cabin foundation, working methodically despite his growing nervousness. He found old square nails, the kind used in the 1920s, their iron surfaces pitted with rust. Fire-blackened stones that could have been part of a hearth or chimney. This was definitely the place where Fred Beck and his companions had made their stand against something that shouldn't exist. At 12:10, while eating lunch, he heard whistling. Not bird calls. This was sustained, almost musical, impossibly long for any human to produce in a single breath. A long, rising note that hung in the air like a question. Then an answering whistle from a different direction, lower in pitch, like a response in a language he couldn't understand. Daniel stood slowly, scanning the tree line with sharp attention. Nothing moved. The mist had lifted slightly, but the forest remained eerily still. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being coordinated around, like pieces on a chessboard moved by players he couldn't see. Multiple entities working together, communicating about him, deciding something important. At 3:40 in the afternoon, a smell hit the camp without warning. Powerful, overwhelming, it rolled over him like a physical force, like wet dog mixed with rot and something else he couldn't identify, something primal that triggered ancient fear responses in his brain. It was so strong his eyes watered immediately. He grabbed his shirt and covered his nose and mouth, backing away from the invisible source. The smell lingered for nearly 20 minutes, so thick he could almost taste it. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. The air cleared. Daniel stood in the center of his camp, heart pounding against his ribs, trying desperately to rationalize what just happened. He couldn't. There was no animal he knew of that produced a scent that powerful, that concentrated. At 6 o'clock, returning to camp through thick brush after checking his perimeter, Daniel caught movement through the trees upslope. He froze mid-step, every muscle locking. A silhouette stood among the pines, partially obscured by branches and fading light. Massive, easily 8 feet tall, it stood perfectly still, in a way that seemed almost supernatural. What he could see was covered in reddish-brown hair that caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. Time seemed to slow. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the camera hanging around his neck, moving with excruciating precision to avoid startling whatever was watching him. The creature didn't move. It was watching him with the same intensity he was watching it. Daniel could feel its gaze, heavy and intelligent, weighing him somehow. He raised the camera with trembling hands, bringing the telephoto lens up to his eye. Then he saw its eyes clearly through the magnification. Not animal eyes. There was something in them, an awareness, a consciousness that stopped his finger on the shutter button. Intelligence looked back at him. Not the simple awareness of a bear or cougar, but something deeper. Something that understood it was being observed and was choosing to allow it. They stared at each other for a full minute that felt like an hour. Daniel couldn't look away, couldn't move, couldn't think beyond the impossibility standing 40 yards away. The creature turned slowly, deliberately, and walked away on 2 legs. Its gait was smooth and natural despite the massive size. Despite the dense undergrowth full of fallen branches and hidden obstacles, it made no sound. No branches cracking, no rustling of leaves, no disturbed brush marking its passage. It simply moved through the forest like smoke, and then it was gone, swallowed by the trees and shadows. Daniel's hands shook so badly he couldn't have taken a photo even if he'd tried. He stood there for 10 minutes staring at the spot where it had been, wondering if he'd actually seen what he thought he'd seen, but the memory was too vivid, too detailed. That had been real. He returned to camp at 6:45 as full darkness descended. He built the fire higher than necessary, feeding it logs until the flames leapt 6 feet into the air, pushing back the darkness. He checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded with a round in the chamber, and kept it within arm's reach. Then he sat with his back against a tree and waited for night to fall completely, knowing with absolute certainty that he wouldn't be alone. At 8:30, the wood knocking began again, but this time it was different, more complex. It came from 3 distinct locations, forming a perfect triangle around his camp, with him at the center. They were communicating, and Daniel was in the middle of their conversation. The knocks varied in rhythm and intensity, creating patterns that felt like language. 3 quick knocks from the north, 2 slow knocks from the east, 4 rapid knocks from the west, then silence. Then the pattern repeated with variations, like sentences being spoken in code. At 9:15 he heard the first vocalization. Deep and resonant, coming from the darkness beyond his firelight, it sounded like an attempt at words but distorted, like someone trying to speak with the wrong-shaped mouth, or after not speaking for a very long time. The sound had phonemes he recognized, syllables that almost formed English words, but not quite. Daniel fumbled for his digital recorder and captured the full sequence. Whatever was out there made the sound 3 times, each iteration slightly different. Learning, maybe. Practicing. The 3rd attempt was closer to human speech than the first, as if it was remembering how. At 11:40, something large began circling his camp in a slow, methodical pattern. It stayed just beyond the reach of the firelight, an invisible presence he could track only by sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the forest floor debris. Heavy breathing, deep and rhythmic. Occasionally it made a low rumbling sound, like a growl mixed with something else, something that vibrated in his chest. Daniel fed more wood to the fire obsessively, keeping the flames high. He didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. Every nerve was electrified with fear and adrenaline. He sat with his back against a tree, rifle across his lap, and waited for dawn with the awful certainty that sunrise might not come. But the sun finally rose around 6:50, painting the mist gold and driving back the shadows. Daniel was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and caffeine and fear, but daylight brought relief. Whatever had circled his camp in the darkness was gone. At 7:30 he emerged from his tent to find something that made his blood run cold. All of his equipment had been moved during the night. Every single piece of gear, from his spare boots to his cooking pot to his first aid kit, had been relocated and arranged in a careful spiral pattern radiating out from his tent. The precision was stunning. Each item was placed with obvious care and intention. Nothing was damaged, nothing was missing. Some items had even been cleaned. The mud on his hiking boots had been wiped away completely. His water bottles had been refilled and placed in a neat row. His mess kit, which he'd left dirty, intending to wash it in the morning, was spotless. His GPS unit sat prominently on a flat rock, facing a specific direction, deeper into the canyon, away from the trail, away from safety. Daniel stood in the center of the spiral, turning slowly in a complete circle. This wasn't random. This wasn't an animal rummaging through camp. This was a message. They were trying to tell him something, to guide him somewhere, and they'd spent hours in the darkness arranging this elaborate invitation while he sat 20 feet away, completely unaware. At 8:15, Daniel made a decision that defied every survival instinct he possessed and violated every rule of wilderness safety he'd ever learned. He packed a day bag with his rifle, camera, and recording equipment. Then he followed the direction indicated by the GPS unit, walking directly toward whatever had spent the night rearranging his world. A quarter-mile hike through dense forest that seemed to grow darker despite the morning sun brought him to a small clearing he hadn't seen before. What he found there took his breath away and filled him with awe and terror in equal measure. Wood structures, dozens of them, interwoven branches forming deliberate patterns that defied natural explanation. Some structures were 10 feet tall, pyramids of carefully placed limbs that would have taken hours to construct. Others were arches, bent saplings woven together with precision that spoke of planning and patience. Some formations were spiral patterns on the ground, made from hundreds of sticks placed in concentric circles. Fresh breaks on the branches showed recent activity. The sap was still tacky. This wasn't old, this was current. This had been built recently, possibly even last night, while he'd sat terrified by his fire. Daniel found more footprints in the soft earth. Multiple sizes creating a story. A large adult, maybe the one he'd seen yesterday standing in the trees. A smaller adult, still massive by human standards. Two sets of juvenile prints, smaller but still larger than any human child. A family group. They lived here. This was their territory, their home. He was the intruder. He was photographing the structures when he heard a branch break behind him with a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the silent forest. Every muscle in his body tensed. Daniel turned slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung over his shoulder, knowing even as he did that if they meant him harm, the weapon would be useless. A massive figure stood at the edge of the clearing, 40 feet away but seeming much closer. 9 feet tall at least, powerfully built with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad, covered in dark reddish-brown hair that rippled slightly in the morning breeze. The face was almost human, broader and more primitive, with a pronounced brow ridge and wide-set eyes, but unmistakably intelligent. Those eyes, a striking amber color that seemed to glow in the forest shadows, stared directly at him with an intensity that made Daniel want to look away, but he couldn't. The creature made no aggressive move. Instead, it slowly raised one massive hand, palm out. The gesture was deliberate, almost gentle, unmistakably communicative. This wasn't an animal making a threat display. This was someone saying hello. Daniel's mind reeled, trying to process the impossibility standing before him. This thing was communicating, using a gesture any human would understand, a universal sign of peace and openness. With trembling hands, Daniel lowered his rifle, letting it hang by its strap against his chest. Then, mimicking the creature exactly, he raised his own hand. Palm out, making himself vulnerable, accepting the gesture. The creature tilted its head, studying him with obvious curiosity. Then it made a deep rumbling sound in its chest. The sound built, shifted, formed into something that made Daniel's legs go weak and his heart stop beating for a full second. Words. Actual words. "You come for old place." The voice was impossibly deep, resonating in Daniel's chest like a bass drum vibrating his sternum. The accent was thick, the pacing slow and careful, but the English was unmistakable. This creature was speaking to him. Daniel stammered, his voice cracking. "Yes, the cabin. From 1924. I'm researching what happened." The creature nodded slowly, the gesture so human it was disturbing. It understood. It was following the conversation. "Old hurt," it said, each word carefully formed. "Your kind hurt mine. We remember." It gestured toward the canyon rim with one massive hand. Daniel followed the movement and understanding crashed over him like a wave. They remembered Fred Beck shooting one of them, remembered it falling into the canyon, remembered the pain and the fear and the death. 95 years later, they still remembered. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, his voice breaking. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm just documenting, learning, trying to understand what happened." The creature studied him for a long moment. Its amber eyes seemed to look through him, past his words, weighing something Daniel couldn't comprehend. Looking at his intentions, maybe. His heart. "You different," it finally said. "You listen." Then it gestured for Daniel to follow with a movement so casual it seemed surreal. Every instinct told Daniel to run, to get out of that clearing and never look back, to forget he'd ever seen what couldn't exist. But curiosity overwhelmed fear. The chance to understand something that science said was impossible, the opportunity of a lifetime. He followed. The creature led him 200 yards through the forest, moving with surprising grace for its massive size. It navigated the dense undergrowth effortlessly, ducking under branches and stepping over fallen logs with practiced ease. They arrived at an overlook above the original cabin site, where Daniel's camp sat far below like a toy model. The creature pointed down with one thick finger. "You sleep, old killing place." Daniel's blood ran cold. The temperature seemed to drop 20 degrees in an instant. He'd been camping at the exact spot where the attack happened, where the cabin once stood, where violence had erupted between humans and these beings 95 years ago. "That place holds memory," the creature continued, its deep voice quiet now, almost sad. "Holds anger." It turned to face Daniel fully. This close, Daniel could see details that made the encounter feel even more real. The weathering on its face, scars from old injuries, the grey mixed into the reddish-brown hair, especially around the muzzle and temples. This was an old one, ancient maybe, a survivor who'd seen things. "Not unprovoked," it said, the words coming with obvious difficulty like recalling painful memories. "Your kind killed game, wasted meat, polluted spring with waste, disrupted gathering place. Sacred to us." The creature touched its own chest with one hand, the gesture achingly human. "My ancestor, shot by your kind, not dead when fell, suffered, called for help 3 days." It paused, and Daniel could swear he saw grief in those amber eyes. "We heard him dying, could not reach him. Canyon too steep, we heard him until voice stopped." Daniel felt sick. Fred Beck's triumphant story of shooting one of them, the tale he'd told proudly in his book and to reporters, had another side. A creature falling 400 feet, still alive, lying broken on the rocks below, crying out in pain and fear while its family listened helplessly from above, calling for help that couldn't come, dying slowly over 3 days while his kin heard every moment. "The Siatic," Daniel said softly, using the indigenous word he'd learned. The creature's eyes widened slightly, showing surprise. "You know old name." "Good. Good, you know, means we are recognized, means some of your kind remember truth." It gestured broadly at the forest around them, encompassing everything. "We are guardians, not animals. We protect old places, sacred sites, keep balance between world of men and world of forest. We were here before your kind came. We'll be here after your kind gone." "You speak English," Daniel said, immediately feeling stupid for stating the obvious. But his mind was struggling to process the impossible conversation. The creature made a sound that might have been a laugh, though it came out as a huffing grunt. "We watch, we listen, we learn, we remember everything." It tapped the side of its head with one finger. "Many languages. Your kind talk loud, talk constantly, make easy to learn. Some of us know the old tongues, the languages of the first peoples who respected us." It explained, haltingly but with growing fluency as it found the words, that the elders of its people could speak several languages. This one had learned English over decades of listening to hikers and campers passing through its territory. Some knew the languages of the indigenous peoples who had lived in these mountains long before white settlers arrived with their guns and gold fever. "Your kind bring noise," it said, its voice taking on an edge of frustration. "Bring lights that hurt eyes. Bring machines that scare prey. Bring disruption to everything. Take and take and take. Never give back." Other figures emerged from the tree line with such silent grace that Daniel gasped. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he counted them. A female, slightly smaller at 7 feet tall, but still massively powerful. 2 juveniles, perhaps 5 or 6 feet tall, watching him with wide eyes full of curiosity rather than fear, all of them watching him with expressions he could only describe as cautious curiosity, the way humans might watch a strange dog to see if it would bite or wag its tail. The speaking creature gestured toward them with obvious pride. "My family. We protect this canyon now, like my ancestor did, like his ancestor before him, back and back through time." The female made soft vocalizations, complex and musical, nothing like the grunts and howls he'd expected. The sounds had structure, rhythm, meaning. The juveniles whistled back and forth in what was clearly communication, asking questions maybe, and receiving answers. This was their language, Daniel realized with stunning clarity. What he was hearing wasn't animal sounds. It was speech, conversation, a mother talking to her children. "You record us," the creature said, nodding toward Daniel's equipment with what looked like amusement. "Like the other one did, long time ago." "The other one?" Daniel asked, his mind racing through possibilities. "Man with sound catchers, strange boxes, in the mountains north of here. We let him hear us. He respected. He listened. He left us alone after. Kept his promise." Daniel's mind raced. It had to be talking about Ron Moorhead, who'd recorded the famous Sierra Sounds in the 1970s, recordings of Sasquatch vocalizations that linguists had analyzed and found genuine language structure in, recordings that skeptics had dismissed as hoaxes but couldn't explain. These beings knew about that. They'd allowed themselves to be recorded by someone who'd earned their trust. The creature stepped closer, close enough that Daniel could smell it now. Not the terrible stench from yesterday, but something earthy and wild like the forest itself. Its expression became serious, almost sad, its amber eyes clouding with something that looked like regret. "Why you come now? Why bring the seeing machines?" It was referring to his cameras and GPS, he realized. "To document," Daniel said honestly, knowing instinctively that lying to this being would be both pointless and dangerous. "To share the story, to show people what happened here, to prove you exist." The creature's expression darkened, its massive brow furrowing. "Stories bring more, always more. More bring danger. To us, to this place, to our children." It explained, in halting English mixed with expressive gestures, that every time humans discovered them, hunters came. Trophy seekers with powerful rifles, scientists wanting to capture them or kill them to prove they were real, people who saw them not as beings deserving respect but as prizes to be claimed. "We are real," it said, its voice dropping even lower, vibrating the air between them. "We do not need proving. We need leaving alone. We need our children to grow up without fear of your kind's guns." The creature reached out and placed one massive hand on Daniel's shoulder. The contact was gentle but firm, the heat of it seeping through his jacket. Daniel felt a chill run through his entire body despite the warmth. He was being touched by something that shouldn't exist, and the weight of that impossible moment pressed down on him. "You go now. Tell your story. But hear this." It leaned close, those amber eyes, ancient and knowing, locked onto Daniel's with such intensity he couldn't have looked away if he'd tried. "We remember kindness. We remember harm. Everything. Forever. Choose which you want us to remember of you." The female approached, moving with surprising grace, carrying something woven from bark and plant fibers. Inside was a handful of hair samples, thick and coarse, and several teeth, large and yellowed with age. "DNA," the creature said, pronouncing the word carefully. "Is that word for proving to scientists?" Daniel stared in disbelief. They understood scientific evidence. They knew what DNA was. They'd been watching human civilization advance for decades, maybe centuries, learning and adapting. "Take it. Show your people. Tell them we are not animals to hunt. We are people of the forest. We have families. We have memories. We have language and culture and history. Tell them, leave us alone." The female added in broken English, her voice higher but no less resonant. We want peace. With your kind. Only peace." The juveniles whistled, a sound that was almost melancholy, like a sad song. One of them, bolder than the other, took a step closer to Daniel. It reached out one small hand, though small was relative as the hand was still larger than Daniel's. It touched his camera gently, curiously, then looked up at its parent as if asking permission for something. The adult male nodded. The juvenile whistled something complex, and the adult responded in their language, then translated for Daniel. "She wants to know if you are the one who will tell truth, not lies like the others." "I'll try," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper, speaking directly to the juvenile now. "I promise I'll try to tell the truth." The juvenile seemed to understand, even though he wasn't sure how much English it comprehended. It stepped back, satisfied somehow. At 11:15, Daniel found himself back at his camp, though he had no clear memory of the walk back. His mind was too full of impossibilities to process something as mundane as navigation. The creatures had helped him pack, moving his heavy equipment like it weighed nothing, treating his gear with surprising care. They left no sign of their presence, no footprints, nothing. It was as if they'd never been there, except for the precious samples secured in Daniel's pack. The lead creature walked with him to the canyon rim, to the point where the established trail began again, the boundary between their world and his. "The old hurt we release it," the creature said quietly, "because you listened, because you saw us as people, not monsters. But others may not be so understanding, others of our kind. Not all want talking. Some remember only the violence, the guns, the death." It pointed to a different area of the forest, deeper into the wilderness. "Others of my kind live there. Younger ones, angry ones. They remember the mining, the logging, the fires your kind set. They have no patience for your kind anymore." "How many of you are there?" Daniel asked, unable to help himself. The creature made that huffing sound again, and Daniel was almost certain it was laughter. "Enough. Not as many as before. Your world grows loud. Our world grows small. We move back and back into smaller places. Soon, there will be nowhere left to move." As Daniel prepared to climb out of the canyon for the last time, the creature spoke its final words. "Bring no one back here. Tell your story. Show your proof. But this place, this is ours. Has always been ours. Promise this." Daniel promised without hesitation. He meant it with every fiber of his being. "Then go. Before the skeptical ones come. They won't understand. They fear what they don't understand, and fear makes your kind dangerous." "Should I be worried?" Daniel asked, glancing toward the deeper forest where the angry ones supposedly lived. The creature's expression was unreadable, but something in its posture shifted. "If you move fast, if you leave now, you'll be fine. They're coming to see why we talk to human, to see if we are foolish. Go now." Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He started climbing. He was halfway up the steep incline out of the canyon, his calves burning and his lungs screaming for air, when he heard the commotion below. Different vocalizations, aggressive and hostile, nothing like the measured speech of the creature he'd met. These were roars, full of rage and challenge. Wood knocking became violent, trees being struck with terrible force that echoed through the canyon like gunshots. Deep roaring sounds from multiple sources, territorial displays of dominance. Then he heard the family responding. Defensive calls, high-pitched warnings, the female's voice sharp and commanding, the juveniles making sounds of fear. Daniel realized with horror that they were protecting his escape. Other members of their kind had come, and they weren't happy about human contact. The family was standing between Daniel and whatever was coming, buying him time to reach safety. He ran, scrambling up the slope, grabbing roots and rocks, pulling himself upward. His lungs burned. His legs screamed in protest. His pack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, but fear pushed him forward with desperate strength. The sounds of conflict grew louder behind him. Roars, crashes, the crack of breaking trees that sounded like bones snapping. He reached the ridgeline at 1:20 in the afternoon, collapsing at the top, gasping for air. Looking back, he could see nothing through the thick canopy far below. But the sounds of conflict echoed up from the canyon, terrifying in their violence. roars that sounded almost human, crashes that shook the ground. The family was in danger because of him, because they'd chosen to trust him. Daniel ran until he reached his vehicle 2 hours later, his muscles trembling with exhaustion. He threw his gear in the back, started the engine with shaking hands, and drove straight to Seattle without stopping. He didn't dare stop. His hands didn't stop shaking for 3 hours. The research team was ecstatic when Daniel turned over his footage, recordings, and the DNA samples. They called it unprecedented, the evidence of a lifetime, career-defining material. They wanted to publish immediately, call press conferences, make a documentary. Daniel refused to disclose the exact location. "I made a promise," he said, his voice firm despite their protests. "That place is theirs. I won't break it." The clients were unhappy. They pushed hard. They offered more money, doubling the payment, then tripling it. Daniel refused every offer. Some promises meant more than money. The DNA samples went to a laboratory with a reputation for discretion. When the results came back 3 weeks later, the lead researcher called Daniel personally, her voice shaking with excitement. The samples were from an unknown primate. Not human, though there were disturbing similarities in certain markers. Not any known great ape, though the closest match was orangutan. The hair showed a unique protein structure never documented before in any primate. The teeth showed wear patterns consistent with an omnivorous diet, but dentition that didn't match any known species. "This is real," she told him. "Whatever you encountered, this came from something that doesn't exist in our current taxonomic classification. This is a new species, or possibly a relict population of something we thought extinct." The recordings were analysed by linguistic experts at 3 different universities, all working independently. They all reached the same conclusion: complex grammar patterns in the vocalizations. Some words clearly borrowed from English and Native American languages, but others that didn't match any known language. They estimated a vocabulary of over 200 unique phonemes, far more sophisticated than anything previously recorded, including the famous Sierra sounds. One linguist wrote in her report, "This is either an elaborate hoax involving multiple specialists in linguistics, anthropology, and audio engineering, or we're looking at evidence of a non-human species with complex language. Given the technical difficulty of faking this data, I lean toward the latter." "This is real," the linguist told Daniel in a late-night phone call. "Whatever you encountered, it has genuine language, complex communication. This isn't animal sounds, this is speech." 2 weeks later, Daniel received a package. No return address. Postmarked from Kelso, Washington. Inside was an old photograph, grainy and faded, the edges worn with age. It showed 5 miners standing outside a rough cabin built from hand-hewn logs. Behind them, barely visible in the trees, was a dark shape. Large, watching. On the back, written in faded pencil, "Vander White Mine, July 1924, FB. They were always there." Fred Beck's photograph. But there was something in the original photo that had never been reported. Something Fred had seen but never told anyone about. Tucked behind the old photograph was a modern photograph, printed on glossy photo paper. It showed the lead creature Daniel had met, standing in the exact same spot as the 1924 photo. The cabin foundation was visible in both images, unmistakable even after all the years. The creature was looking directly at the camera, its amber eyes reflecting the flash. Around its neck was something Daniel hadn't noticed during their encounter. A leather cord with what looked like a carved stone pendant. The message was clear. "We've always been here. We always will be. We remember everything." Daniel tried to return to Ape Canyon a month later, driven by the need to know if the family was safe, if they'd survived the conflict he'd heard. The trail was closed. Large orange signs declared geological instability. Forest Service barriers blocked every approach he tried. He hiked in from different directions, attempting to access the canyon from the north, the east, the west, all blocked. Rangers at the Spirit Lake station said the closure was indefinite. When he asked a ranger he'd known for years what was really happening, the man looked around nervously before speaking. "Strange reports coming out of there," he said quietly. "Aggressive wildlife, unprecedented territorial behavior. Things breaking trees, moving boulders. Sounds at night that don't match any animal we know. We're keeping people out until we understand what's happening, or until whatever it is moves on. But local rangers told Daniel a different story off the record, speaking in hushed voices over beers in small-town bars. Hikers had reported seeing figures in the forest, hearing vocalizations that didn't match any known animal, finding massive footprints, wood structures appearing overnight in areas that had been clear the day before. But the Forest Service didn't want a media circus, so they closed the area quietly. "There's something in there," one ranger told him. "Something protecting that canyon like it's sacred ground." We've had 4 separate groups turn back, saying they felt like they were being watched, being warned away. One group had rocks thrown at them from the trees. Nobody got hurt, but the message was clear. Stay out. An elder from the Yakama Nation reached out to Daniel through a mutual contact 2 months after his return. His name was Thomas Walking Bear. They met at a coffee shop in White Salmon, a small town overlooking the Columbia River. The elder was in his 70s, his face deeply lined, his eyes sharp and knowing. "You were chosen to hear their message," the elder said without preamble, stirring sugar into his coffee with slow deliberation. "The Siatik don't reveal themselves lightly. In all my years, I've known only 3 people they've spoken to. You're one of them. You must honor what they told you. They gave you truth, sacred truth. Don't let your people turn it into entertainment. Don't let them turn it into a hunt," Daniel promised. Again, he meant it with everything he had. The elder studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You have an honest face. I believe you. They chose well." The documentary was never completed. Funding was mysteriously pulled a month before filming was scheduled to begin. The research organization disbanded suddenly, key members accepting jobs at different institutions across the country. The evidence still exists, stored in unnamed facilities, backed up in multiple locations across the country, and on secure servers overseas. Photographs authenticated by experts who swore they showed no signs of digital manipulation. But it's not public, not widely known. Whenever Daniel tried to share it, obstacles appeared. Legal threats, technical difficulties, database corruptions. It was as if something or someone was ensuring the evidence stayed hidden. Daniel now works as a consultant for Native American cultural preservation. He helps tribes protect sacred sites from development, using his wilderness expertise to document areas that need protection. He works with lawyers to file injunctions against mining companies and logging operations. It's good work, important work that feels right in a way his previous life never did. Sometimes, late at night, he hears wood knocking outside his home in the foothills. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 knocks. The pattern from the canyon. The first time it happened, 2 months after his return, Daniel had been sitting at his kitchen table, unable to sleep. He walked to his back porch slowly. He picked up a piece of firewood he kept by the door. He knocked back, his heart pounding. 3 knocks. Pause. 1 knock. The forest fell silent for a moment that seemed to stretch forever. Then, from somewhere in the darkness beyond his property line, an answering knock. A single strike, clear and deliberate. Not random, not coincidence. Communication. Daniel smiled despite his fear. They'd followed him home, or they had family in these mountains too. Either way, they were checking on him, making sure he kept his promise. He hears it maybe once a month now, always late at night when the world is quiet, always the same pattern, and he always responds. It's a conversation he never expected to have, with someone who shouldn't exist, and it's the most important conversation of his life. Daniel Reeves' encounter remains classified as unverified by official channels. Government agencies won't comment. Scientists publicly dismiss the evidence as elaborate hoax, despite private admissions that they can't explain it. But the evidence he brought back can't be easily dismissed by those who've seen it. DNA that doesn't match any known species. Vocalizations that linguists confirm contain grammatical structure. Photographs that experts can't debunk. Hair samples that show protein structures never before documented. But perhaps the most compelling evidence is this. Daniel Reeves turned down $50,000 to reveal the location, then $75,000, then $100,000 from a reality TV show. He walked away from fame, from proof, from vindication, because he gave his word to a creature the world says doesn't exist. What does that tell us? Maybe that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, and some beings, no matter how different from us, deserve the same thing we all want: to be left alone in peace, to raise their children without fear, to exist without proving that existence to skeptics. The Sasquatch are still out there, in the deep places, in the old forests that haven't yet fallen to chainsaws, in the high mountains where humans rarely venture. They're watching us, learning from us, hoping we'll learn from them before it's too late, before the last wild places disappear and there's nowhere left for them to hide. If you enjoyed this case file, remember to hit that subscribe button. We're racing toward 1,000 subscribers by New Year, and we're posting daily content to get there. Help us reach that goal. This has been Void Case Files. Stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, just because something wants to remain hidden doesn't mean it isn't real. Until next time.